This is Joel Greene, and I'm the author of the Immunity Code and The Way. We're going to talk here briefly about amplifying fasting. So if you think about it, a basic, really easy to understand, easy to get your arms around idea is that fasting historically has always gone together with foraging. Like if you think about it, in other words, and this is something that's easily provable in a number of ways. You can prove it by taking a survival course or watching shows like Naked and Afraid. And it's that when a person is in a survival situation or a hunter-gatherer situation, your first preference really is very energy dense things like meat and fish, but they're not necessarily the easiest things to get. And so what we do in the process of trying to get those things is two things. Number one, you go hungry. We call that fasting. And then number two is that you forage for whatever you can get. So typically, like whatever you can get is going to be things like roots, mushrooms, berries, things like that. And what this tells us is something very, very important. It's that foraging and fasting, or rather going hungry, have always gone together. Always gone together all throughout human history. And in this modern era, we have this contrivance called fasting, but there's a missing component. And it really has to do with the piece that goes with that, which is foraging. Now, if you accept the idea that nature's rhythms naturally optimize the body, and most of the biohacking movement is based on that idea. It's based on the notion of aligning with nature's rhythms. So you're aligning with light and dark, you're aligning with heat and cold, you're aligning your body with things like getting your feet on the ground. And one of the rhythms that's been completely missing is dietary, in that nature has provided these incredible synergies between foraging and fasting. So in other words, the foods that you would consume most typically when you're in a fasted foraging state, meaning you're going hungry, your first preference really would be, like a buffalo or like some salmon, but it's hard to get. You can't get it. And so what you're doing is foraging. In the meanwhile, you maybe have some mushrooms, some berries, some roots, some leafy greens, things like that. Well, it turns out that the bacteria that are fed by the different substrate in those kind of foods, they are actually very synergistic with fasting. So when you break this down, you look at bacteria like bifidobacteria, the family of bifidobacteria, or species like Akkermansia muciniphila, what you find is that they are very synergistic with very specific pathways in fasting. For example, Akkermansia is an AMPK activator. And so fasting activates AMPK. And Akkermansia also is multiplied during fasting. And so there's a synergy here. For example, things like berries, things like roots, they spin up these bacteria like bifidobacteria that are endemic and central to human health, that really are at the center of the gut immune axis. And so what we see is that an easy way that you can actually maximize the benefits of fasting while having to just do it less is simply the day before you fast, mimicking foraging foods. So mimicking things that you would find in a starved state or in a state that you might find on a show like Naked and Afraid, for example. You're going to be eating whatever you can get. So you're going to be eating things like berries, you're going to be eating things like roots, you're going to be eating things like leafy greens, things like mushrooms. And these foods act like substrate. They are substrate for the bacteria that are synergistic with fasting. In fact, you can graph this. You can actually create a spreadsheet and show the pathways activated by these bacteria, and they are almost one-to-one identical to fasting. And there's no magic here. It's really the way nature has provided to optimize human fitness, or to optimize organismal fitness, so that in a foraging state and a starved state, we're eating foods of lesser preference, things that aren't our first pick, but those foods of lesser preference actually potentiate bacteria that synergize well with going hungry and help the body to amplify things like autophagy and all these other things that we're trying to get out of it. So the net is that really we don't have to fast as long. And that brings us into a whole other topic, which is, well, can fasting have a downside? Yeah, it can, absolutely. You can do it too much. And you see a lot of that nowadays. You see a lot of people coming on the backside of 3-4 years of fasting having lots of issues. So yes, fasting has lots of benefits, but we don't want to have to fast too much. And an easy way to kind of level up a bit is to really reinstitute ancestral rhythms, natural rhythms that we find that couple foraging with fasting together to multiply the benefits of fasting. So when you add in exercise and then cold into the picture, you have a complete picture of nature's natural rhythms surrounding fasting. So in other words, exercise is you're having to exert energy to get foods of lesser preference, usually quite a bit of energy. At the same time, very often it's probably cold. And again, this is really provable. Just take a survival course, just watch shows like Alone or Naked and Afraid, and you see exactly that. You see people who are cold, see people who are hungry, having to expend tons of energy to get foods of lesser preference, and then transitioning eventually into getting some kind of a feast, getting like, a deer or fish or something really substantial. And that pattern is easy to verify, and it has all of the elements that maximize human fitness. So you have cold, you have exercise, you have spinning up the commensal bacteria, and then you have going hungry or fasting, which drives autophagy and helps to clear senescent cells and all these great things. One of the reasons that diet today is really in the Stone Ages has to do with something that is so simple, so obvious, so basic, so in your face, it's kind of a forehead slap. And that is the impact of time. So that we've lived in this vacuum thinking that we can do something like fast, or we can do something like a keto diet, or we can do something like a carnivore diet, and it's going to always work exactly the same. And that is absolutely 100% not the way things work. Time introduces forces that are easy to account for. And in fact, in my new book, I call them the 4 fundamental forces of time. They are the accumulation of things, they are the degradation of things, compensation, and attenuation, those 4 things. And what you see is that when you introduce things, let's take fasting, for example. In fasting, you can have an accumulation of things that may be good in small amounts, but when we get too much, they're not such a good thing. One example is the gut symbiont Akkermansia muciniphila. Now, this is a bacteria that we need for gut health, and it's the primary bacteria responsible for the health of the gut mucus layer, but you can get too much. And too much Akkermansia wears the gut lining out. Well, one of the ways you get too much is through starvation. In fact, when you look at studies on starvation, almost always you see gut dysbiosis with it. Fasting is starvation by another name. And so one of the issues you see over time is an accumulation of too much Akkermansia, wears the gut lining out, and you'll find now a lot of people will tell you that they have gut issues over the long term because of things like fasting and doing different types of diets. If you enjoyed this, then you can follow me for more content at realjoelgreene.com on Instagram, realjoelgreene on X, and I'm also on TikTok, realjoelgreene.